Okay, let's begin. First of all, historical folks, real experts in the field, even today, question when the Cold War actually started. And nobody really seems to know when exactly it did. All of these things here in red are some ideas that people have forwarded over the years. Some people think it started the second we bombed Japan and ended the World War II. And others might think it was the Truman Doctrine in '47, or North Korea against South Korea, or the Berlin blockade in '48. Some say it may even be as late as the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I think we were well into it by then. But all of these things happened that we know. They're all historically significant in their own right. I think I want to dwell a little bit on this. When we bombed Japan in 1945, obviously we established ourselves as the world power, the leader of the free world, which we still are today, the greatest country in the world, which I feel we still are today. And we were the only country with a bomb. And we used it, and it seemed like, at least for a very short time, that meant we were the superpower and no one was going to, goof off with us. No one was going to fool around with us. It didn't take long, though, for that to change, obviously. Notice the date. These headlines are all from the good old-fashioned Clinton Daily Idol. You see the date, 1949. So, is that, I can't see here the light, the 1949 Idol. Even our president at the time, Harry S. Truman, is announcing that Russia has a bomb now, too. And later on, just maybe the same week, one of our leading scientists announced that, guess what? Russia has a bomb now, too. And that, of course, changed the game significantly. So, in 1949, 1950, Clinton hired its first civil defense director. And unfortunately, I thought you could see this a little bit better, but you can't. But this is the application that they used back then. The person was hired by the Board of Selectmen. It was, the first director was James McNamara. I haven't figured out there's so many James McNamaras around. It could be the police officer's dad. I'm not sure. He was a World War II veteran. I don't know, but I wish you could read the question, but right here, the question is, have you ever been a member of or involved with the Communist Party? And that obviously was a pretty big question at the time. This was his very first report, James McNamara, director, 1950. So all the town reports that come out every year, this was his first report. You can see all familiar names with who was in charge of what. Dr. Goodwin was medical and health. We have Mike Kelly, of course, was the police chief. William Powers was the fire chief. Harold Robichaud was involved. Franny Coleman on plant management. So it was all, we were just getting going on civil defense. And remember, the feds came up with this. They made it mandatory for the cities, but the towns had to kind of accept civil defense as the civilian defense corps, so to speak. And later on, there was even a women's auxiliary civil defense. And I know there's some familiar names there. This is a Cherubini, a Collmore. I think there's a Parker in there. I should have kept the names, but I did not. And then, anyway, all hell broke loose. October 1961. Russia exploded this huge nuclear bomb, all right? They, again, had the bomb only 5 years after we dropped our bomb on Japan. This one was a little different. This was an aerial bomb that was dropped somewhere over the Arctic. And to give you an idea of its power, the bomb that we dropped on Hiroshima was the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. 15,000 tons of TNT. This bomb was 50 million tons of TNT. And to this day, it is the largest, most powerful bomb that was ever created and tested in the world. So if we had the rest of this article, which was probably a national article anyway, Khrushchev kind of laughed about it. And he said, geez, it was a little more powerful than we thought. And he said, he actually said, was quoted as saying, I don't think I'll punish the scientists for it, but it was a mistake. It shouldn't have been that powerful. But in reality, let's be honest, he was trying to send a signal, a sign that, look what we got, and now you're not going to fool around with us. And that's when the whole dance started, I suppose, when you think about it, called the Cold War. So needless to say, most countries around the world were angered by this. They were extremely upset. It was a show of power by the Communist Party. Most of the world obviously condemned it. And then came the issue of fallout. And it was, people were obviously very, very worried about it. They didn't know where it was going to come and when it was going to come. And we didn't know then what we probably know now, but obviously this was a huge worry at the time. So even the local papers said that the fallout was going to come on this Thursday or Friday. People were ready all over the place. And it's interesting to note, most people I don't think realize this, that we were so concerned about it that the item daily came out with a radioactivity report. So every day in the item, they had this readings of 4.43, whatever, and this is kind of what's happening in our atmosphere. And they had radioactivity centers, monitoring centers at the police station, the fire station, and the town hall. Anybody know who was in charge of sort of the measuring or monitoring radioactivity in Clinton? Ram Murphy. Remember Mr. Murphy in Clinton High School? Robert A. Murphy. He was the one in charge of the radioactivity monitoring. Most of us had him in high school. Yeah. So with everything going on in the world, this is just a Life magazine cover, but it was time to build shelters. But by now, you really needed to start thinking about shelters in your own home, whatever. And every town kind of handled it in a different way. Clinton, I won't get into that yet, but Clinton seemed to want to take care of its own. Everybody, we will do something for everybody, all right? Most of the other towns announced almost immediately, probably because of size and the square mileage of area towns. That was like, we're going to help you, but you're on your own. You better start thinking about building a fallout shelter in your home or a neighborhood or something like that. Clinton didn't go that route right away. So then we now have, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was about a year after Russia exploded that bomb. And this was a true battle of wits. And Khrushchev was testing the United States and a very young president. I believe, was he the youngest? He was the youngest at the time, John F. Kennedy. All right? And then we came up with this. So in the summer of 1962, and again, these are item headlines, our people were seeing a buildup of troops and missiles in Cuba, which was only, 100 miles off the coast of Florida. And it wasn't just missiles that they were accumulating. There were many troops going in there as well. And we were concerned about it being that close in our hemisphere. And Kennedy, of course, had to do something about it. This came out of the item as well. It just shows we have many U.S. bases all around that area. But Kennedy's answer was to let's put up he called it a quarantine, which is a term we all know now, that's for sure. But, and the reason for that was everybody else was calling it a blockade, but he called it a quarantine because blockade is a war term. And he was, of course, trying to be very careful about, you know, we're not declaring war, we just want this to happen, and we don't want that to happen. He was being very, very clear about it to Khrushchev. This was one of the many, many comics that came out in the newspaper. You know, Test of Nerves. I think a lot of us remember Eyeball to Eyeball was another one. And here is, of course, you know, shots of off the island of Cuba, planes, ships, all of it. Now it's funny that I don't know, and there may be many, many tie-ins locally to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't know, but I do know this one. All right, this young man right here is John Winnicott. He was a 1960 graduate of Clinton High School, and as soon as school was over with, he went into the Navy. And he told me the stories many times. John passed away very young. He was only in his 60s, I think. But he was out to sea 6 months, and they were headed for shore leave in New York City. And right before they ended up coming into New York, they were told that there would be no shore leave, that everything changed, they would dock, and nobody would be leaving anywhere. Supplies would be coming onto the ship, a lot of them, and then they were going to ship right back out to the Caribbean. And he didn't know the reason, and none of his, you know, his mates knew either. And only when they got out to somewhere halfway to the Caribbean, did they play over the PA speaker on the ship, which was the USS Willard Keith, was the name of the ship. They played a pre-recorded message by President Kennedy that said, this is what is happening, this is what your mission is, whatever. And he went out and was part of his ship was part of the blockade or quarantine, whichever word you want to use. That's the only story I know locally, and the only reason I know it is because 45 years ago this summer I married John's sister. That's all I know. One thing that I don't think a lot of people know, and at least certainly I didn't, is that I think people, we know there's been a movie, 13 Days, which is about that 13 days of eyeball to eyeball, right around Cuba. I mean, everything was tense. It looked like the world was going to fall apart. But it almost seemed like it was just over when it was over. That was it. Everybody went home, and there was no problem. I mean, look at this. Look at this. This is dated February 9, 63. So it's, you know, almost 6 months later. They're still there, a lot of them. They started to remove troops. They started to remove missiles, but they weren't in any hurry because they didn't want to. Certainly didn't want to look like they were the weakling or they had kind of lost that. So, yes, they listened to Kennedy, and I don't know what kind of negotiations were going on at the time behind the scenes, and they did remove their missiles and their troops, but it took a lot longer than the general public realized, that's for sure. And I think it was more like a year later, in October of 63, when it was completely clean, and the troops were gone as well. So meanwhile, in good old Clinton, on the other side of town, we had this going on. How many of you remember the little railroad tunnel down at the depot? Remember that one? Yes. Okay. For those of you who don't know, it was a walking tunnel left over from the old days when trains were flying through Clinton all the time. And so it was a stairway down at one end of the railroad tracks, one side of the railroad tracks, went down a long set of stairs, and kind of a runway that you can see right there to the right, and then it went up stairs so that you could always pass back and forth no matter what trains were coming through. Well, I think it was the Board of Selectmen were the ones that decided it would be a brilliant idea to make that into a community bomb shelter. And it probably was not the greatest idea, but they had it planned out that it would hold 80 people, would shelter 80 people at once, and the selectmen were the ones that were just adamant that that was going to be a great place to be. In the meantime, the fire chief was Tom Moore. He said it should be condemned. It was a public nuisance, and it was. If you've been through there, you knew. What's the one thing you remember about going through there?
It's a little piece of the New York subway system.
Yeah, but how about one word?
Urine.
Urine. Oh, that's interesting. I was going to say smell. Yes. You could not walk through there. You had to run through there. That's how bad the smell was. It was a place for winos or whatever you want to call them. They would hang out there. Always vandalism, always broken bottles, a few people sleeping in the corners, whatever. It was tough. It was a tough place. And so there became this battle of wits with the Board of Health, the Board of Selectmen, the new Civil Defense, and the Fire Chief. And these guys here, this one here is Oscar Baer from Clinton, and this is Carol Cullimore, who at the time, in the 60s, early 60s, was the new Director of Civil Defense. The other guys are regional or state civil defense people. So finally, I guess cooler heads prevailed, and Fire Chief Moore ended up kind of winning the battle and said, this thing's got to go. So this is what it looked like. It was falling apart anyway, but this is one of the entrances of the thing. The stairs went straight down, and so finally they ordered the DPW to slam down the stairs, cover them up, and then I think it was going to be filled with gravel later on or something like that. So it's still there today, somewhere under the ground, right near the memorial place there at the depot. But now it's probably been filled in totally or whatever. So finally, again, they decided, and it took a long time, that the Sterling Street Tunnel was just not going to cut. It wouldn't work. And again, the public nuisance. And then, of course, the schools. How many of you remember those drills under the desk? Always a good time, right? Duck and cover. If you haven't been over to the Russian Icon Museum, you need to go see that exhibit. It's great. And they have, of course, the full video. You press a button and you get the whole music and the whole thing, which Bill McNally set up next door. So if you want to, after this program, if you want to hear a little ditty, a little music by Bert the Turtle, it's in the next room, under the stretcher, so you'll hear it. This is typical drills. I think we all actually believe that if you were under your desk, you would be safe from whatever the Russians did to us. But I guess we all believe that. We you know, whatever. So now the local newspapers, the item, that's how I kept track of all of these things. There are many different ways that the item would inform their readers about what was going on. Obviously, the international stories were always there, but here's two things that happened during those Cold War years. John P. McMahon, Jr. Where's Debbie? You're here? That's not a relative? John P. McMahon, Jr. and Company. Nope? Okay. No, Debbie's father, McMahon, built houses, but this McMahon built shelters, at least, and I know he built quite a few in the town of Clinton. And there's the good old phone numbers. If you're old enough, you know that your phone number was always Empire, and then the number 54807. That's what it was. You have to say Empire. I don't know why. And then there's even a place, I think that's Scott Associates, which is under the bridge, Water Street, near the post office. And that was a way to get, they had some kind of system where you could get fresh water for your shelter. Everybody was starting to build them. Hastings Pharmacy would come out once a week with various health informational, almost like pamphlets, but they were in the newspaper. And this was about fallout, what it means, what happens, you know, what are you going to feel like if it gets you, whatever. And then, of course, there were some comics, like Bombshell Buys, you know. Somebody was trying to be funny. It's a house, if you want to buy it, with oil heat for $17,000, if you're interested. And this one is interesting because we're so busy talking about Berlin, Germany, and the wall, and all that kind of stuff, that you read that ad as VFW troops are going to West Berlin. But they were really talking about Berlin. It says, you know, we don't want to go alone. We have 300 East Berlin chickens to fight, and we need everyone's help to lick them. And then we'll barbecue enjoy them for only $1.50 a person. And after the barbecue, we'll do this, grease pig chase, egg throwing contest, blah, blah, blah. The annual VFW outing. But it was kind of a cute play on words. It certainly reflected the times, that's for sure. And then, of course, we had the international type of articles that the item published. This is a scientist telling people how to survive a nuclear bomb. And it's funny, I don't know how you others feel about that, but I mean, I was in '62, I was 10 years old. I don't think I was thinking too much of it. I don't think I was afraid because I was too dumb to be afraid at that age. But I'm sure people worried about these things. And this was something that we knew some other country could wipe us out if they wanted to. But then again, they also knew we could do the same thing. And that was the dance, I guess, in a way we call the Cold War. Kind of sizing each other up, pushing each other's buttons a little bit, but not too much. You know, that's really what I liken it to anyway. So of course we had movies, and certain movies like Cold War were definitely the bad guys, of course. The commies were always the bad guys. This is the Globe Theater, which is now the Clinton Savings Bank parking lot, long gone, and that was a movie called The Iron Curtain. Failsafe was playing at the Strand. Failsafe was one of my favorite movies. A young president who accidentally, sends a nuclear bomb over to, Russia. It's quite the story. Henry Fonda played the young president at the time.
What year was that movie?
I think that was early 60s, early to mid 60s. Here's two more. The commies are coming, the commies are coming.
Jack Webb?
Yes, Jack Webb, yes.
Just the facts.
Just the facts, Ron. Come on. And then, of course, the Red Menace. An army of commie reds threatened our country's freedom. There were all kinds of movies at the time. All right, Clinton's first shelter. Kind of interesting that all this talk now in the item was about shelters and what was going on. You had to build a shelter. You had to do something. You had to protect yourself. So all of the Protestant ministers, Protestant clergy got together and they wrote this huge article for the item, which basically was saying, it's important to be able to protect yourself, but maybe instead of worrying about, protecting yourself from a bomb that's going to be dropped, you ought to be praying and working toward peace, not worried about where you're going to, duck and cover or whatever. And it's funny because I noticed that Clinton's first shelter was at St. John's School. So the Catholics said, let's build the damn shelter. And it seemed like the Protestants were saying, hey, let's have peace here and everything. I'm generalizing. But, so here's the first one. And it was in the old St. John's School, which today is the superintendent's office, Clinton Public Schools. And here are two people supplying it. This is Paul Mohan on the left, Lloyd Severy on the right, and they're putting in the supplies. Now remember, the public shelters were supplied by the federal government. It was all these things coming in, all kinds of good stuff that you needed, whatever. Private shelters were different. That was in your home, and you had to worry about canned goods and water and all those kinds of things. Now this is it today. I know it since I worked on that building for 12 years. I knew that as kind of like a closet, but it is, notice, it's concrete ceiling, walls, and floor. And that can't possibly be the shelter, because the shelter, when it came about, held, I think, 110 people. So there's no way in heck that held 110 people. So I think that was the storeroom on the last slide, where the goods were kept. And it would have been under the front stairs of St. John's School. How many of you went to St. John's School? You got a few, okay. The main stairway, which was on the Church Street side. Today it's all covered up and there's like a little garden in front. But I think the supply room, I know the supply room was under that set of stairs. but the main shelter, I can only imagine, must have been the cafeteria, because it was an inside room, all bricked in, and that had to be where the 110 people could survive. These are just some of the supplies that the feds would have sent, and this is thanks to the SEMA group down on high near Water Street. They still have unopened boxes of Geiger counters, radiation detector kits. Here's the sanitation kits that supply up to 50 people, and there's a list of all the good things that are in it, including a toilet seat. The second shelter, of course, was in our town hall. And once again, another building that has been totally renovated. So the town hall was built in, I think it was 07, 08, 09, and of course didn't have a bomb shelter then. Somewhere in the 50s or 60s, they built a bomb shelter there, and since that time, it's been completely renovated, and no one can find the bomb shelter there. So once again, I think this might be the storeroom of the shelter, but not the shelter itself. You can see, look at the ceiling, and it's all brick. There are no windows, of course. That's just a real strong light in there. They use it for files and records and things like that. So Clinton, and I know you can hardly see this, but this A, B, C, D, E, whatever, were all public shelters now. Clinton finally got its act together and said what we need is a lot of little public shelters all over the place. Lancaster had, I think, 2. Both of them were at Atlantic Union College. Sterling, Berlin did the same thing. Berlin's first one was, I think, in the home of some McAndrews. And I should know the address, but I don't. But most of the area towns, again, the civil defense, they had a civil defense, but the whole idea of the town's leadership and everything said, we can't help you. We don't have a place big enough where, you know, everybody can come. Plus Berlin, Lancaster, these places are huge, you know, land-wise. And to come to one place doesn't make much sense. So they said that almost right away. You're on your own, but we will help you with plans on how to build a shelter, how to do this, how to do that, whatever. Clinton set up a lot of these public ones. And the plan was that whatever part of town you were in, that's where you would go when the alarms went off or whatever. Now, it's funny because I've been running around looking for shelters. And I didn't get into this house, but this is up on Bristol Ave. And the house is vacant now, and I did speak to the grandson. I tried to get in, but I couldn't. But anyway, this is probably one of the biggest private shelters.
That's me.
That's you? All right, want to tell us about it? Because I couldn't get in, and I would love to know about it. I know Donna.
I was waiting for your email, because I sent you pictures.
You did?
Yes, I did, remember? To the, John.
You're done.
You forwarded it to him before it was backfilled. I was waiting for you to call me.
I never got them. I never saw them. I almost called Donna, and I used to work with Donna, and asked if I could get in. But anyway, tell me about it. It's supposed to be fantastic.
That shelter was started, my father started it in 1961, and it was complete, it's a complete monolithic fort off of the house. So it is separate and
really?
And buried. It's as a matter of fact, the story is, it was done before the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I was about 4 years old at the time, and I remember going down to the A&P and getting the canned goods and writing the date on the cans.
Really?
For that, yes.
Oh, cool.
But the thing was, the town would come up because it was so elaborate, and one of the stories what my father was, the town came up and one of the officials said, you know, we can commandeer this thing. And he says, try it. But they actually, those things, the town actually gave him those boxes that you had.
Oh, the town did?
And everything, and he did have them in there for a couple of years, and then they finally came back. back
Yep.
and got, I have since replaced them, but.
You had Geiger counters?
There's a Geiger counter and I forget how you pronounce it, dosimeter or whatever.
Dosimeter?
That went on, but the whole thing in there is, if you notice all those pipes,
Yes.
there's multiple doors. You go down, it's what they call a monolithic pour, and the base of it was poured, and then he had concrete trucks on the day lined up the street because at the time they could do about 6 yards per truck. And it's when they say this monolithic pour, it was completely done at the same time, so there were no seams.
Oh, wow.
So there was no seams, and off of the cellar, it comes down, and radiation can't turn corners. So,
I found that out. Radiation cannot turn
so
corners.
inside, there was 3 doors that went back to back, and then inside, you put solid concrete blocks up against the last door when you're done. And if you notice those air pipes,
Yep.
the same reason. You would see those in commercial buildings back in the old days,
Yep.
was for air.
Oh.
See how it doesn't go around it?
Yes, okay, yep.
And it's actually quite a...
It's kind of like...
It's a survivor, and excuse me, the thing that's a little bit different about that is, one of the other quick stories is...
No, that's fine.
It's up on the road, okay?
Yeah. We didn't want to announce where it was.
I know that,
Yes.
They don't. But
Although we're all going up there after this program.
The reason the cemetery is up there in the light is because it's all sand.
Yes, yeah.
So, this is in a residential neighborhood. My father was a builder, that's why he actually built it. And when he started digging the hole, the amount of fill was huge. Because the sand would keep caving in. And there was probably 60 kids on that street playing in it. So he would have to dig it all the way out, because it's deep. And it's probably got about maybe 2 to 3 feet of fill on top of it. But the thing was, with the machine, he had to dig a really big hole. So the neighbors would come over, and this was before the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, he's one of the few that listened to Kennedy to say, "Build."
Yes, yep.
So they were really busting his cracker. What are you doing? And they called it, my name is Flanagan, Flanagan's Quality.
Really?
And he took a lot of ribbon from the neighbors and just kept going. Because you know the way they are.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
What a waste of money, what are you doing?
Yep.
Big hole, well.
Wow. I know
Growing up, that thing was backfilled, done. The Cuban Missile Crisis came, and I'll tell you, the neighbors stayed on that street. And nobody ever mentioned a word of it again.
Yeah, I know Donna's son, I talked to about it, and he said that, he said a story about town officials coming up and basically saying, almost like, we want to stay here if the time comes. And your dad's saying like this, I built this for my family. It's not like, you know,
but that's the reason that one is a survivor versus a lot of the ones that were built with Worcester and White is because it's all sand. I mean, it was all waterproof.
Yep.
But the thing is, it's got such good drainage that it never had an ounce of water in it.
Wow.
And it still doesn't all these years later.
Really? And what is it today? Is it storage or nothing?
It is. I mean, my father started putting tires down there and stuff. I actually cleaned it out, but he's got the water tanks and he actually built bunk beds down there.
Really?
It was set up.
Yep. It was Chief Levenger, Chief of Police.
He's up the street.
Yeah, he's the one that said that that's the most elaborate one in town. And I didn't know anything about it, and I've known Donna for years,
It's back when I was maybe in the 80s, or 70s, I think I was still in school, so I was home. And there was actually a fellow from the U.S. government walking the streets. And they were doing a survey of like these shelters and stuff in the area. And some people had them in a corner of a basement and things like that. There was different ways to do it.
Yes, yeah.
he did come over and he says, everybody's pointing over here. And I said, yes, this is the house.
Yeah.
Right. I was surprised, but it was the government actually.
Did you guys like play in it as kids or something?
It's the interesting thing. It stays at like pretty good temperature because it's, remember, buried.
Yep.
Completely. So it's actually like everybody said, gee, nice place for a wine storage.
Wow.
But
That's fantastic. I'm so glad you came because I was dying to know this. I was dying to see it.
It would have been a trip if you had seen the pictures before that was backfilled. That's the whole gist of that.
Really?
The picture is worth 1,000 words.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Wow. Thank you very much for that.
John, the Bouchards had one built in their cells when they built their house.
Who?
The Bouchards?
Yes, they took it, correct. They would do the corner. So you probably were down there kicking the sand in, right?
No.
That's Chief Levager's brother, if you haven't figured that out. All right, so what else were we doing? And thank you very much for that. You know, the Clinton Hospital was in the center of everything as far as offering classes and first aid and all those kinds of things. Sterling was again, did not have public shelters, but would help anybody build their own private shelters. And this is kind of interesting, that last paragraph, which you probably can't read from here, but it just said, civil defense also reminds us that in case of bombing, there will be no electricity, no water, no telephone or gasoline, and roads may be impassable. So, you know, you really think of how devastating such a thing would be. Lancaster, we had a lot of Lancaster news, and we have, they were going to give a course on how to monitor radioactivity. The schools, just like Clinton, was practicing all of the evacuation drills. I believe that if I read that to you, it says that they, shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think, the buses stayed at the schools. Nowadays, of course, they leave kids off and they go someplace and they come back at the end of the day. Because we were so worried about these things, in Lancaster at least, the buses stayed right there, just in case they needed to bring kids home in a hurry. And Lancaster again offered a course in how to build a home shelter. There's the fallout shelter signs that we used to see all over the place, right? And the Livingstones are here with me tonight, thank God, thank you. They are the owners of a technology company that now owns the old Clinton post office. Wave or something, you two. Hey, thank you. And so I went out of the blue and knocked on the door and said, I know you used to have a bomb shelter here, I want to take some pictures. And they thought I was crazy, but they did let me in. And on the left side, you see, I'm sure most of you remember that there was a sign right over that stairwell that said fallout shelter, you know, right here. And so on the right is a little collage. I was downstairs where we think the shelter would have been, and Radius is the one, the company that I think bought the building from the town or the feds or whatever. And so they did a lot of these renovations as well as the Stanley from Berlin. So when you go down those stairs, and we're going in this way, the very first, it looks, that's a bathroom, a very modern bathroom. Then you keep walking around and it's just a wall, solid brick. You know, walk around that corner, there's another bathroom and some kind of supply room or whatever. That's my best guess at what the shelter could have been. You know, and because it has, it's an inside room, no windows, all brick or cinder block, whatever, that probably was it. But again, it's guessing. And again, I thank Kathy for letting me in and giving me the grand tour. So this is the only shelter I happen to get into. And I want to thank Jim Hastings. This is another Greeley Hill one, but at least Jim is an old friend of mine, and he has neighbors that he knows had a bomb shelter, and he basically, you know, ran interference for me, and I ended up there taking some pictures. So once again, they have that corner, you know, it's in the basement of a nice ranch house up on Greeley Hill. Again, you don't go straight in, there's a wall, you got to take a corner, And I honestly did not know about that business with radioactive particles can't take corners. I found that amazing, and the police chief told me, and I thought he was full of it. One of his officers told me. I said, no, it can't possibly be. And I guess it's absolutely true. The only thing I can liken it to is like COVID, where COVID is in the schools and in church, but it's not at Walmart or Target. Anyway, something like that. This is some vents here. I don't know enough about it. This family uses it as storage only, but completely clean. Those things that look like shelves are on hinges, and so you know, he didn't know himself. The home, I think he said, was built in '54, which would have been perfect timing for all of this, really. And I don't know if they were beds, and then somehow, like during the day, you could fold them down or fold them up. They'd be folding them up, but they're all on hinges, and they could have been just regular shelves as well. But there they are. You know, the ceiling was, you know, these wooden beams, and then on top of that was several layers of concrete blocks or cement or whatever. So it was really a great place. I took quite a few pictures, and you know, at least I got in to see a modern one anyway. All right, my last story is certainly this one that I have to tell, and some of you, I'm sure, remember this, but you cannot talk about the Cold War, at least from a Clinton viewpoint, without the story of Billy Goddard and the B&M Railroad Tunnel. And here we go. This gentleman right there is Billy Goddard. He was a hard-working businessman. He owned Goddard's paper store, Goddard News. All right, lived up on Cedar Hill here, and I know he was in the Rotary Club, and I am too. And I know that some people who would still remember him say he was very, very hard-working guy. This is back in the days when he'd get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and go to Acton, where the train came in to get all the newspapers to bring them back here and be open at whatever it is, 5:30, 6 o'clock. Back in the day, Goddard's was like the anchor store for High Street. It was the most popular place, newspapers and everything else. And so he had an idea, and this was his idea. When it came time for shelters, he just started in and said that the abandoned B&M Railroad Tunnel up near the dam, some of you I hope have been in it, would be a perfect town-wide shelter, that the entire population of Clinton could all go to this place. And this was even before we were talking about, you know, other public shelters. He was the first guy to really start talking about shelters. And his idea was everybody comes together. We'll take care of our own completely. And so there he is pointing this out, that we can easily get 2 stories of living quarters in this tunnel all the way to the end, and then also this last part. So his plan was to extend those living quarters all the way out to the Clamshell Bridge. Clamshell Road is the bridge in the background. So because the walls were so high, we'd go all the way down and dome that off, cover that up as well. And he was convinced 14,000 people could fit in there. And people, I think, thought he might have been a little crazy. I'm not sure. But, and he was the guy who put his money where his mouth was. That's for sure. I can say that much about him. I never knew the man. I've heard a lot of different opinions about him, believe me. But his own money, using his own money, and I have this ad out there, he took out a full-page ad in the item, Clinton Daily Item, and invited everybody up to the railroad tunnel, Tuesday at noon, October 3rd. And it was, he convinced his Rotary members to have their Rotary Club meeting there. And so he foot the bill for everything. Notice, I think 500 people ended up coming. He said he's going to provide food for 100 people, and the little small print says there's probably going to be a lot more, so you're going to have to bring you might have to bring your own lunch. But he wanted people to see what his idea was. And then this, if you're in Rotary, like John Schmidt and I, this is typical Rotary humor. So he put this ad in the paper, his own expense. Everybody civil defense. You're expected to be at the tunnel, and blah, blah, blah. You shall be released from your jobs at full pay. Note to employers, if you do not go along with this, please send the bill to me, he says. If you do not come, Edward Gibbons will be sent after you. And then we Rotarians fear this. And then failing all else, you will be trapped in a corner by Sky Pilot Bailey, who will tell you jokes for a full hour. And this is the ultimate horror. Ask any Rotarian. Well, I don't even know who Sky Pilot Bailey was, to be quite honest with you. But anyway, we still have this same type of humor going on at Rotary, believe me. But he just called out the troops. He wanted everybody up there. He was footing the bill, and he wanted people to see his idea. And Bill Coulter, who was also in the Rotary Club at the time, he kind of played up the whole thing like maybe it was a real bad joke. And that's why I really don't know how to tell the story. I don't want to say this guy was a nut. I don't want to, but he certainly was a visionary. He had an idea, and he followed up on it, and he put his money where his mouth was. He paid for so much of this. But the article, the full article, is hilarious. It talks about, you know, he's talking seriously, and then someone says, hey, the chicken is pretty good, isn't it? You know, stuff like that throughout the whole thing. And so I don't know if Bill was making a joke of it or not, but, you know, well, what do you think? This was the question most often asked by nearly 500 damp spectators between gulps of potato salad and cold chicken in the depths of the B&M Railroad Tunnel Tuesday noon. And here is the mock-up that Mr. Goddard paid for. Maurice Poulin built it, and you can see these are all Rotarians, and they posed at the entrance to the tunnel. Now, it was only a mock-up and only went so deep, but the guy's plan was that this was going to be the way, all the way through it. There was going to be enough sleeping quarters or whatever, like upstairs, second floor, and like recreation areas and more social areas downstairs. And he had it all worked out, all of it. And it ended up being a huge success. 500 people showed up. Of course, the Rotary Club always sings, and what do they sing? Rock of Ages. And so anyway, they had a 100-pound birthday cake. That was made by Armin Guy. And that was a birthday surprise for Maurice Poulin. WBZ-TV was there, Channel 4, directing traffic and telling everybody where to stand and what to do. The full interview was on TV that night. And then, of course, as you can see from the next article, he kept going to all of these government surplus centers, buying anything he could. And again, all his own money. So this is, in a nutshell, is his proposal. This is what, and again, he didn't ask anybody. I don't think he looked for any input. He just announced one day in the paper, this is what we're going to do here. So, use the abandoned B&M Railroad Tunnel as a townwide shelter. It can be 2 stories high. We'll extend the end of the tunnel to the Clamshell Road Bridge. Power can be generated from acquired from the generators at the base of the dam. It's on high ground, so we don't have to worry about flooding. Some kind of sewer lines, we can pump, everything would be pumped downhill anyway. He actually worked out with Mr. Rauscher that they could have an artesian well that would supply fresh water. This part of the plan might not have been so good. All the cars, if indeed we were warned and the alarms went off, we had to get there, all the cars would stop at the top of Chestnut Hill, and everybody would walk from Chestnut Hill to the mouth of the tunnel. He wanted to provide a bakery. He wanted to provide fresh bread for everybody every day. He knew the federal government would supply the radios and the cots and the batteries and all kinds of stuff. He expected Clinton Hospital would set up some kind of area to help with minor injuries and things like that. And then the big thing was he expected every town service club to kind of jump on this bandwagon and go with it. So Lions, Exchange, Elks, and his Rotarians would really be pushing this. So this timetable, all of this happened in like, really, I'd say 2 months, something like that. Every day in the paper, there was some big news from Billy Goddard about what he was planning, what he was going to do, what was happening. So September 13th is just the day he announced it. It was in the paper that basically a Clinton man has an idea. That was it. By September 27, he had unveiled plans for the open house, and the Rotary Club had agreed to have their lunch right up there. He built a set of stairs from Route 70 up so that the people could get there easily. He asked town officials for police protection, but that was a little preliminary because the cops said no. And, you know, he was very upset over that, but nobody knew yet who the hell owned the tunnel. All right? So Goddard was just going ahead with this, but nobody knew if the town owned it, the railroad owned it, MDC owned it. Nobody knew. He took out the full-page ad, not October 3rd, but September 30th. He took out the full-page ad. And by the way, he had printed 2,000 extra copies of the item that day. Once again, on purpose, to spread the news. I'm having a party, come on up. So 500 people came. Finally, on October 4, after the fact, B&M officials gave Goddard permission to proceed with his plan. So he went to Boston to talk to B&M railroad people, and he went with a blank check. That was in the item too. Went with a blank check basically saying, how much you want for the tunnel? Here you go, what do you want? And they didn't say because I guess there was a lot of legal implications, but they just said, don't worry about that for now. Just continue with your plans to make it a town-wide shelter. Civil Defense, October 9, Civil Defense officials inspected the tunnel. October 10, Goddard was the speaker at the Clinton Lions Club, trying to drum up some support. October 16, people actually talked all about this plan at this huge conference, the Civil Defense Conference in New York City. And they were talking about this plan by Mr. Goddard in an old railroad tunnel. By October 19, a WPI professor inspected the tunnel, and he released a formal report. October 20, Army Corps of Engineers were doing a survey. They planned a survey of it, an inspection. And then the last thing you ever hear about it was November 4. So the first thing we ever heard about this plan was September 13. The last thing we ever heard about it was Goddard said, basically, I've taken this thing as far as I can go. And it's now up to the service clubs and other people to come forward and make this happen. So these are quotes I took out of the paper. These are real quotes from real people. So this was, the Civil Defense has completely failed me. That was Mr. Goddard, because they weren't working quick enough. And he actually said that to the reporter while being recorded on WBZ TV, which, believe me, caused all hell broke loose the next day when Civil Defense authorities heard that on TV, him saying that. He also said this, individual shelters, in my opinion, would be like trying to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a rowboat. So his belief was we get everybody together. There's strength in numbers. This was, at first, the WPI professor that said there must be a flaw somewhere. This plan is too perfect. The National Civilian Defense Organization, this is Mr. Goddard again, is made up of men who only work because they can achieve civil service status and hope to retire on a pension. That was his opinion of civil defense. And then he said our tunnel will be the very first constructed as a model for the rest of the country. And B&M even kind of bought that for a while. They said, how many abandoned railroad tunnels are there in and around the United States? And if this can be done, you know, wow, we can do that to every one of them. We also had some other kinds of quotes going on. Like somebody actually at the luncheon said, do you think God wants us to follow one man? I think it's absurd to put all our eggs in one basket. Clinton should have several shelters in various parts of town. If the enemy came, thousands would be trampled to death in the rush to get here. The tunnel project cannot, or at least should not, be considered as anything except an additional resource, yet an important one. That's finally what the WPI professor figured out. That, yes, this is a good idea, but it can't be the only idea. I recommend, and he said this too, the same professor, I recommend that publicity attendant to the tunnel be played down as much as possible. Remember, the town was completely divided. There were people who thought this guy was absolutely out of his mind, and there were other people who said this guy is doing everything he can to save the town. This last quote is a beauty. I love it. People can't even find a place to park on High Street when the stores are open. Can you imagine having a few thousand cars at the top of Chester Hill? The crowd would panic. It would be mass confusion. Yeah, definitely. So anyway, I'm ending tonight's show with this. I talked to several old-time Rotarians on Tuesday about Mr. Goddard, and he might have some relatives sitting here for all I know. I never knew the man. I don't know what he was like. I just know that opinions were all over the place about him. He certainly was a nonconformist. He was an idea man. He certainly was. But as I said now, this is the third time. One of the few people that when he had an idea, he was willing to pay for it. You know, he was going to buy the tunnel. He bought supplies. He's the one who paid Maurice Poulin to build that structure inside the tunnel. He just did it because he thought that was a great idea. You know, was he a patriot? Was he a visionary? Was he a crackpot? I don't think any of us know. I think at the very least we can say he was a hardworking businessman who had the thoughts of Clintonians in his mind and the safety of this town. So, with that, can I, yeah, please, any questions? Do we have any questions at all? I doubt if I can answer them, but, oh yes, sir, go ahead.
One comment and one question. I think the term sky pilot was a World War II Korean War era phrase that was used for chaplains in the Army. And
oh! What was this? So, sky pilot was like a reverend.
Yeah.
Oh. I can't imagine any reverends in Rotary. I should say that. What? In the old days, yes. Yeah, we can't convince the clergy to join Rotary anymore. Not at all.
The question I had was, did they ever test town-wide area sirens?
I believe, yes, I believe they did, yeah. And there was, and I should know that, but there was certainly like a system, like almost like the old fire whistles, you know, whatever. 222 meant what? No school? Is that no school? Oh, really? Yeah. I think was it 55 was brush fire. This was, I don't know, like one long blast. I think was a warning to you had 15 minutes to get sort of undercover. I think 3 in a row was like the most serious. You pull the car over and you get out, double park, whatever it takes, middle of the road. You park the car and run and get in shelter. So that was part of life in Clinton and every other place too. I don't think Clinton was unique in any of this except that tunnel. That was unique, no doubt about that. Yes?
Terry, what happened to the mock? Was it taken down right after that?
I think the mock-up stayed there for a long time, and I remember as a kid that there was wood and pieces of junk in there for quite some time. So I know it was vandalized quite a bit, and they even hung lights all the way through the tunnel for that luncheon. And they found it, less than a week later, most of them were knocked out by kids or whatever. But there were traces of that, I would say, by the late 60s. They were in there. You were just a baby then. But
Yeah, thank you.
you're welcome. Anything else?
And what year was that?
I think that was right around the Cuban Missile Crisis.
So 62?
Yes, yeah, it might have even been 61. But he was the first. He was an interesting guy. And that picture of him in front of the depot, right after this thing, wasn't even over with, he bought the depot. And he announced that it would be the new fire station, police station, and courthouse. Just announced it and said, and then before you know it, I think somebody else ended up with it. And then, one more story, right after that, I believe he bought 156 acres in Sterling. And it was right on the item. And he said something to do with JFK's father. What's his name? Joe. Joe Kennedy was looking for a summer retreat in central Massachusetts, and he had decided that that would be a great place to do it. Not Joe Kennedy, Mr. Goddard. And he bought that in anticipation of Joe Kennedy probably moving out here for the summer.
So when did he buy the railroad station?
I don't think he ever did. I don't think it was never ended up being purchased at all. And now it's been bought by Greenway Trust, or it's going to be the rail trail. And it's
No, I'm not talking about the tunnel, I'm talking about the station.
Oh, the station was then bought by Stan Starr.
Yeah, but when did he buy the railroad station?
I think the paper had him doing a down payment, and it's, and he posed in front of it and everything else like it was going to be for real. I don't know if he really bought it or not.
Okay.
If he did, it didn't last long, and maybe it's because he realized that the police and the fire and the courthouse were not coming. So
My thinking would be, well, maybe that's the only reason why the railroad even bothered talking to him about the tunnel.
maybe. He got a lot of press in those days. Anything else? Please enjoy our exhibit.